Today, I wanted to share with you one of the most important lessons you can learn from the world's best, and targeting something that is a big pain point for a lot of surfers, that being excelling in poor conditions. The most recent WSL contest at Huntington Beach just finished up, and this problem was actually made aware to me last year when I competed there. Brian from Longboard Sessions actually met me there, and he was telling me that if the professionals were surfing out at his home break in New Jersey, that they'd be struggling too. But after surfing with the pros out at Huntington Beach, he did realize that they are just that good. He said that this actually got him to stop blaming the waves, and it was a really big eye-opener for him in this respect, that it was more about his own surfing. To solve this, I actually ended up working with Brian on 3 different elements that we were able to take away and glean from the professionals at Huntington. And for Brian, it was actually the last one that we'll speak about today, which really allowed things to click and allowed him to excel his surfing and, importantly, his practice out in subpar conditions. So unfortunately, I wasn't able to be at Huntington this year. I'm actually just started traveling through Europe and South America. Be traveling for about 6 months, and at the moment we're coming from Istanbul in Turkey, which is really beautiful. Had a look at the contest at Huntington though, and there are a lot of the things that we're going to speak about today involved within that contest as well, so we'll run through that. Now for the edit today, I have some footage from Brandon Holly, who was actually able to film me last year at Huntington, so shout out to him, and I'll put a link down to his channel down below as well, which you should definitely check out. Now, with respect to what we can actually take away from the professionals at Huntington, I think Devin Howard said it best on the webcast this year, and it's actually the ability to capitalize on that first section. We saw that the people that were getting scores were able to make either use of the critical section out the back for a tight pocket nose ride, or they were able to use that steep critical face at the start of the wave to do a big turn. If we're not able to capitalize on those important sections, then we leave a lot of potential untouched. I find that this is a really important thing to make sure that we're addressing in our own surfing. A lot of the time, unfortunately, we don't get to surf perfect point breaks like Noosa and Malibu and all of that. A lot of the time we have to make do with the subpar conditions which are quite steep, short, and really challenging. And so things like our turns, cross steps, and nose rides, if we're unable to get it at the start of the wave, can be really difficult to practice. All right, so these were the things that I was talking about with Brian, and we really distilled this down into 3 important skills. And again, the last one probably being the one that really allowed Brian to really hone his skills in steeper conditions for where he was at, so definitely important to go through this one. But for the first one, it's actually the ability to make sure that we're in the right place in the lineup and that we're making the most of the start of the wave. And in terms of the skills that we need for that, firstly, I'd say it's early identification and preparation for the wave. So there's that concept of making sure we're hunting spot X out in the water, that we're actually paddling towards the wave when they're coming towards us. If we think that waves are just going to come straight to us, especially at beach breaks like Huntington, like the waves that Brian has in New Jersey, a lot of the time they're breaking here, there, and everywhere. And although there may be a place where it's a little bit more consistent in one place, they can obviously break elsewhere, and it's difficult to be in the right spot. And then the sweep and everything like that we might not be accounting for can drag us in different directions on the wave. So the early preparation, early identification, paddling towards the wave to try and paddle into the right position is going to be a big one. And on that note, if you do notice that you're sweeping or getting out of position because of the sweep, setting yourself up with a nice landmark on the beach can be really helpful there as well. The other part to this first point is actually going to be making sure that we're preparing ourselves at the start of the wave appropriately. And this refers to the pop-up and the takeoff that we're going to be using. A lot of the time in the early beginner to intermediate stages of our surfing, we rely on one single pop-up and think that that has to do everything for us. But we've actually got 3 key pop-ups that I like to work through with people. We can simply think of this as the different angles that we're taking off on. Are we popping up with our board facing straight towards the beach? Are we popping up on an angle further down the line or towards the shoulder of the wave? Or are we popping up with the board facing towards the whitewater? Now, what the pros are really good at doing is making sure that once they've identified early, once they've gotten themselves and paddled into the wave, they know what pop-up to use. The biggest thing I see, first of all, is surfers just using a pop-up straight towards the beach, no matter the section. And this is where they can lose the wave. If we're popping up with the board facing straight towards the beach and we've got a really tight critical section that maybe warranted an angled takeoff, then we need to make sure that we actually have the skills that we can utilize these different pop-ups to make sure we're making the most of the section. In tight critical sections, we may use something like an angled takeoff to point us down the shoulder of the wave so that we can capitalize on that section. For sections where we are a little bit too far out on the shoulder, this is where using something like a faded takeoff can be great to put us in the section for the nose ride or for the turn, getting us nice and critical so that we're not taking off too far out on the shoulder and then missing the start of the wave. And as we spoke about in the subpar conditions, probably missing most of the meat in that wave as well. And then there are some scenarios, of course, where we are just using a straight takeoff, where we're popping up with our boards facing straight towards the beach. A last little part to this is where we're popping up on the board. And in tricky, punchy conditions, I'll pretty much outright say if you don't have a really good tail pop or a pop up at the tail of the board and we're still engaging the middle of the board straight away from our pop up, this is going to be a big problem. And this actually brings us into point number 2. Point number 2 is actually making sure that we're using the thirds of the longboard effectively and correctly to avoid us from being trapped. A lot of the time, if we're used to just standing on one part of the longboard and we're not utilizing the thirds depending on what the wave is requiring for us, then we can get stuck. The ideal way that I like to think about this is if we need to make a quick turn happen once we've popped up on the wave, speaking to our last point, and we're in the middle of the board, there's no way that we can effectively and efficiently engage the rail as well as the tail to turn quickly if we're too far up the board. The way I like to think about this is the middle of the board is where we gain our speed. The back of the board is where we're going to get the tail to react. And then the front third, of course, is where we're going to nose ride. But to this point, if we're not using the middle of the board to gain speed and accelerate down these fast critical sections, then we're going to be slowing ourselves down and probably missing a section down the line. On the other point though, if we're popping up in the middle of the board like we spoke about before, or if we're trying to engage turns too far up the board, this can be definitely something that I see quite a lot holding people back as well. So this is something that we've really got to get on top of. Now, the very last point, point number 3, and this is the one that worked so well for Brian with where he was at in his surfing, is inside rail pressure. Now, what do we mean by inside rail pressure? A lot of the time we may hear inside rail pressure when it comes to nose riding and making sure that whilst we're cross-stepping towards the nose, we have a bit of weight on the inside rail. And this is absolutely true, although there's a little bit more context that's required for that. But the big one that I usually see for critical takeoffs and for steeper conditions, the types of conditions we're speaking about with regards to Huntington and making the most at the start of the wave, is people dropping too low from the start of the wave. So they'll take off and maybe they're using an incorrect takeoff. So a lot of these things can actually parlay one into the other. And what they're doing here is they're dropping all the way to the bottom of the wave. And this is where we're likely to nosedive because we've got that steep vertical wave face. And I guess all of that steep vertical wave face is using its energy to push us down to the bottom of the wave. It's really hard to avoid. And so this is something that does prevent us from surfing and also accelerating our progression, because when we face these tricky, challenging conditions, we're left at the bottom of the wave and then the wave kind of just races off without us. So how do we overcome that? It is around the inside rail pressure, which becomes really important. So what I actually got Brian to do was actually learn to pop up, and as soon as he popped up, he's engaging the inside rail. So for him, he's surfing a lot of lefts back home as well as some rights, but it was more about making sure that as soon as he popped up, that back foot actually preferenced one side of the rail rather than flat into the middle of the board. And what this does is from the top of the wave where we're popping up, we actually then notice that we get a little bit of an angle and a drive across the wave as we're going towards the bottom. What's so good about this is we can then properly utilize the speed that we get from a critical takeoff like this. So as we're approaching that bottom of the wave, we can then use this inside rail pressure at the bottom curve of the wave to accelerate ourselves across the wave face. And then it gives us all the opportunity in the world to do what we need to in a really critical, good spot on these challenging waves to do the other things that we want to practice and we want to be doing, like our cross-stepping, nose riding, turning, all of the above. And so once we've set that initial line, we can also make sure that as we're going across critical conditions, like we're likely to get in these sort of waves, that we actually make sure that we've got a little bit of a subtle weight on that inside rail as well. Again, vertical wave faces want to push us down towards the bottom. Our way to counteract that is to make sure that we have weight on the inside rail so that we can keep ourselves at least around that midpoint of the wave, not dropping too low. A constant little bit of subtle pressure through the inside rail goes a long way to put ourselves in the right position, and from there we can actually get some good practice in. So this was exactly what I ran through with Brian, and this was a little bit of homework for himself when he went home as well. And since then, he's been reporting some really good things. Over the last year, he's had a lot of massive improvement, and essentially what he said was this allowed him to make better use of the waves that he had more consistently, and therefore his practice was able to just grow because of that. And with regards to what we've been speaking about today, you've probably heard last week we actually launched longboardsessions.com.
In a world filled with conflicting opinions on how to surf,
which is made exactly for this, finding out exactly where you're at currently with your surfing and knowing exactly what the next steps need to be for your progression. That's what we made it, a platform and a community to highlight where you're at and what you need to do exactly to progress, because I find a lot of the barriers that we face as surfers is, I guess, knowing where we want to go, but not necessarily what we need to do to get there at the right time. And a lot of the time we do skip to things like our cross-stepping, like our nose riding, but there's some little barriers in the foundations or in the base of our surfing which do inhibit our way to progress through to those things and to be able to do those effectively. So it makes sure that we're not leaving any kinks in the chain of our longboarding development and building a really good framework so that we can accelerate and build to the level of surfing that we want to get to. If you are interested in that at all, then please feel free to check that out in the description down below, and you can find out more there. Again, if you have any recommendations for videos that you'd like to see whilst I'm in Europe and South America, then please let me know, as well as for any other topics that you'd like me to hit on the channel as well. We'll try and get to those into some future videos. But we'll leave it there for today, and we'll catch you on the next one.